I'm Amber Thomas. I am Vice President of Advocacy at AMT, the Association for Manufacturing Technology. And I am here today with Harry Moser, founder and president of the Reshoring Initiative. And today we're going to talk about federal funding to boost chip production in the United States. How you doing, Harry?
Everything's good. It's great to be here with you, Amber.
I always am happy to see you. So, it's August, and in August, everybody in Washington is happy because Congress goes home actually for the month of August. And so, leading up to the August recess, there was a huge flurry of activity on Capitol Hill. And one of the things that, did see action was the CHIPS bill, which has been being negotiated for probably over a year. Congress approved a slimmed down version of the original CHIPS Act. The direct funding for semiconductor chips amounts to $52 billion, going directly to companies that start manufacturing facilities in the United States. There's also a 25% investment tax credit to boost chip production in the United States. That's a substantial amount of money. And, while the bill did have a lot of bipartisan support, there were some objections. And the objections went something like this. It amounts to industrial policy that picks, one company over another, one industry over another. And Senator Sanders even went so far as to say it's a bribe to get companies to stay in the United States. So, Harry, I'll ask you first off, what do you think about those takes on the CHIPS funding?
Well, first, at the bottom line, I believe the funding is necessary. The U.S. was once preeminent in chip production, has fallen to, I think we produce 13% of the world amount or something like that, and very dependent on Taiwan and also on China. And so we're not in a good place. So something had to be done. It had to be done quickly because you don't want to keep falling behind. And so I'd say it had to be done. But I would say this is not really industrial policy. This is a subsidy. And therefore you have to see it as what it is. If we had an industrial policy, the subsidy would not have to be so big. Just for reference, a reporter from the leading Chinese business journal, Caixin, called me in May and said, Harry, what's going on? Intel's manufacturing cost in the US, she said, is 70% higher than Taiwan semiconductors cost in Taiwan. Given that, and despite the national security concerns, how can it make sense to manufacture semiconductors in the US? How can that be sustainable? And so probably he's wrong on the 70%, probably it's not so much. But across all products, at the moment, U.S. manufacturing cost is about 40% higher than Chinese. And I suspect it will be somewhat similar in semiconductors. And therefore, this is a subsidy. It's not industrial policy. If we had industrial policy, then we would take the actions to reduce that 40% down to 10 or 20%. And at which place the subsidy would not have to be as big because you're subsidizing is to make up for our higher costs.
Well, given that that higher cost and the current shortage that we're experiencing, really a global shortage, what do you think the impact of this particular bill and funding will be to the current situation and even looking more long term?
Well, clearly the $50 billion plus has to have an impact, at least on our budget deficit.
You think, but
remember Dirksen used to say $1 million here, $1 million there. Pretty soon you've got real money, and this is $10 billion here, $10 billion
it seems
there.
It's getting higher.
So clearly we have to revitalize this critical industry here. But my concern is that the impact will be short-lived. I've already read articles forecasting that within 3 months or 6 months, there are going to be significant surpluses of chips available. Okay, and these foundries that we're talking about with the 52 billion are not going to be built or running for 2 or 3 or 4 years. So there's no way of anticipating whether there'll be a shortage or a surplus or whatever it will be then. So therefore, I believe that what we have to look at is that the U.S. cost is higher, and we lack a large domestic industrial market for the chips. Now we need some of the chips for the military and so on. We want to make those here, but the amount of chips they're going to be able to make is far in excess of what the military can consume. And therefore, if our chip foundries are going to stay busy, they're going to have to be producing chips at a higher cost than the Taiwanese or Chinese chips and selling them to China to make servers, electronic medical devices, infotainment systems, et cetera, to ship back to us. So we're going to go from right now, if we don't do it, we're going to be dependent on Taiwan and China for chips, and instead we're going to be dependent on them to buy our high-priced chips to make things for us. Now, I don't like either of those, and therefore an industrial policy that would make the U.S. competitive in a broad range of products, so the market would decide to bring the work back to the United States. So all those products would be assembled here. That would be a good industrial policy, whereas this is a subsidy.
So speaking of industrial policy, Harry, there is a second component to this bill that directs almost $170 billion actually into scientific research and development into advanced manufacturing technologies. It's spread across several agencies: NIST, DOD, DOE, Department of Commerce, and it expands programs like Manufacturing USA, regional technology hubs, and, triples the funding of the manufacturing extension partnership, extension partnerships, MEP program. That seems to be getting a little more to what you're talking about as far as industrial policy. But what really in your head makes up a good industrial policy that, protects national security, creates jobs, and leads to economic growth?
Yeah, I'd say all those things are nice. I wouldn't spend that much on R&D because R&D, the results of R&D, the development, the processes, the things that are developed, they flow so easily from one country to another that I'm afraid that we're going to spend 100 billion developing the R&D here, and the products are going to be made in China or India or somewhere else. And so if the bills allow that to happen, then that's wrong, and that's not a good spending of money. But what I would do instead, to me, good industrial policy is policy that levels the playing field, that makes it so that U.S. companies voluntarily, without subsidy, without coercion, without anything, decide, and foreign companies both decide that it makes most sense to supply the U.S. market by producing in the U.S. market. By coming out to IMTS and buying some machine tools so they can produce more here. Okay, so the way to and the reason they don't do that now, as I said, is that U.S. manufacturing costs are maybe 40% higher than China and maybe 10-20% higher than Germany. And so what we need, 3 or 4 things. First, skilled workforce. Clearly, we have for decades lacked the skilled workforce that, for example, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Japan, South Korea, that these countries have. So we need a massive shift of resources from liberal arts degrees. It'd be tough for Starbucks to get the baristas, that might happen, to technical apprenticeships and engineering degrees, the areas where we have shortages. We should make complete career data available about the income of apprentice graduates. I get really worked up every time I see these Department of Education, Department of Labor charts. They have a bar chart like this, income going up with number of degrees, no high school, community college, bachelor's degree, math. Okay, headline: education pays $1 million more lifetime income than high school, and never do they put in the income of people who passed an apprenticeship. So they're just force feeding the guidance counselors and the students with the belief that the only way to get ahead is to get a degree. Whereas apprentices, there's lots of people who pass an apprenticeship and they're making $100,000 a year. and because working overtime doing it, or maybe they own the shop now, and so it's a viable alternative, strong alternative. We need multiples of what we have, and the government is hindering it by their lack of giving out all the information. So skilled workforce always number one. Second, first year expensing. Being able to write off the capital investment in the year in which the investment occurs, and that is still 100% valid this year. Goes down to 80% and then 60% in subsequent years and phases out. And most people agree that that's an excellent program. When I used to sell machine tools, I very frequently come across companies that said, I didn't really need it until next year, but the accountant said we made a lot of money this year, so I'm buying it this year to reduce my taxes. And if that's what it takes to get them to automate, to get them to buy the newest equipment, then I think that's wonderful. Eventually, the government gets its money anyway. It doesn't increase the amount of depreciation they take. It just depends when they take it. Now, the R&D tax credits, I would only allow the R&D tax credits if the production occurred in the United States for at least the first 5 years. Otherwise, you don't get the credit. And I would lower the dollar by 20 or 30%, which very quickly would make the U.S. dramatically more competitive. So though that's an industrial policy, and that's more or less what the other countries do. If they have the skilled workforce, they set their taxes, they get their currency low relative to the dollar, and they win. And we don't do those things, and we've relatively lost.
And even when you're talking about tax policy, the temporary nature contributes to so much uncertainty that it's very hard to plan. Like the things that you mentioned are, things that AMT has been advocating for in Congress and the administration, not only in this Congress, but as you know, these are ongoing issues in the past and looking to the future. They are very, as you know, it's not easy to get tax reform and it's not easy to change the way we educate and train people and their long-term goals. Are there things that we can do in the short term, or maybe look at it as, are there other industries right now that may need the kind of help that the government just gave the semiconductor industry?
Rare earth minerals. Everybody agrees that we're so dependent on that I don't know 80% or something. Either the rare earth mineral comes out of China, or the minerals come from other countries and go to China to be processed into the form in which it eventually gets used in our chips, in our military equipment, in all kinds of things. So it's ridiculous to be so dependent on that. In our own industry, think carbide. I've read repeatedly that much of the carbide that makes the carbide cutting tools comes out of China. And maybe we form them into the inserts here, but that most of the carbide comes there. Do we want to be dependent on that? No. Even machine tools. When I started back in the 60s, the U.S. was, I think, I'm quite sure, still the leading producer of machine tools in the world. And I'm sure we produce 2/3 or 3/4 of what we consume. And now that's not true anymore. And I'd love to see us come back. I'd love to see either our existing companies expand, new companies start up, foreign machine tool makers put in more factories, as some have. Mazak, Morsiki, and so on have put in factories here. Hardinge has recently reshored some machine tool production from offshore. So, but not enough. I mean, if we ever got into a war and we had to dramatically increase the output of tanks and missiles and things, we couldn't make the additional machine tools to use to make the things that we have to do. It doesn't make sense. Solar wafers, clearly solar is going to keep gaining and will eventually largely replace fossil fuels, but we're still dependent on China, which produces the wafers that we eventually make into the panels. So that doesn't make any sense. We ought to be able to make the wafers here. And I think you can pick amongst these the ones that when you make this product, well, that means there'll be more demand for the things in the supply chain down here that feed into that, and you'll be able to make more things up here because this thing is now available. So I'm working with a couple of groups that are thinking about that and trying to come up with the optimization for that. And I think the government could do a better job of picking and choosing that way.
Well, Harry, this has been a really enlightening conversation for me, and there's a lot more to talk about, as we move forward. But just to end, why is this topic relevant to our industry, and why going into IMTS should we be thinking about this?
That reminds me of an old historical event when one of the economists said, it doesn't matter whether you're making potato chips or computer chips, as long as we're making billions of dollars worth of stuff. So now I could say it does matter to those of us who make metal chips that we have computer chips available. Okay, so just to update this a little bit to our current situation.
I set you up for that
one. and so first there's going to be billions of dollars worth of machine parts going into the semiconductor production equipment, which all these facilities are going to have to buy, and a significant portion of which the machinery comes out of U.S. facilities. Okay, and so that's significant, and that's what people ought to be looking after. The chips being available to make machine tools here and in friendly countries allows us to increase capacity, increase automation. That's good. It's more likely that the chip-dependent products will be assembled here. So even though our costs are still relatively high, if a electronics company knows it can get all the chips it needs here, it's much more likely to put its assembly plant for electronic products here than it would be if they knew they were going to have to be dependent on some foreign source for them. And I think finally, it's a tangible sign of the country's commitment to manufacturing. We can all, rest a little easier knowing that, to a certain extent, the government has our back in this. That it's going to help manufacturing recover.
Thanks, Harry. You heard it here. Harry and I will see you at IMTS. And
yeah,
thanks for watching.
Looking forward to it. Yeah. Bye-bye.